Hello there, welcome back to my Pauper Flophouse of Fun. This week I'm trying something a little bit off the wall. I'm not going to make any claims that this is the new Tier 1 deck or anything, although I usually don't do that anyway. What we have here is an LD deck, a blue-green land destruction deck. So this is sort of based on the very popular, like I see them quite often, mono green LD decks, where the goal is to just like LD your opponent just like over and over again and then like play a crusher as soon as possible. So having tried those decks sometimes, because I like LDing some people out with Thermal Karst and Acid Moss, like those are pretty good cards. I find those decks don't work all that often, mostly because they tend to rely on like the Arbor Elf, Wild Growth, like / Utopia Sprawl type mana thing to get off the ground. When you're playing mono green, you only have one 3 mana LD spell, so you need to play all these like 1 mana things. But then your deck becomes very like sort of consistent in the sense that you have tons of the same cards that do the same things, but very inconsistent in the sense that if you just don't have a hand with like a Utopia Sprawl in it, or you play your Arbor Elf and then it gets lightning bolted, then a lot of the time you're left with like a million Reaping Sows, Acid Mosses and that sort of thing, and you don't get anywhere. Also, there's the problem where you like LD their first 5 lands, but unfortunately because it's Pauper and things are cheap, they like cast a Think Twice or they cast a Preordain and then they just start playing their cards anyway. So after some trial and error, and by some I mean quite a lot of trial and error, I've come up with a deck that's fairly good against a decent section of the metagame, where we can like really punish things like bounce lands and like slower decks, but we're not 100% dead against the other decks as well. So here we have a very sort of kind of evenly split blue-green mana base. There's more islands and such than you might expect here, simply because it's so important to get like Temporal Spring on turn 3. The Coiling Oracle's pretty good too, obviously. We have only a few Utopia Sprawls, because I don't really like to go all in on them. Like I think they're pretty good. Like if you manage to get one on the play, it speeds you up a reasonable amount and lets you hang with a lot of the faster decks. But it's not all that important in the grand scheme of things, because we're intending to get like more permanent mana sources out of our deck anyway, rather than doing things ASAP and then drawing a Utopia Sprawl later being horrible. We're just sort of vaguely hoping that we have one in our opening hand, and like cutting down on the late game atrocious draws at least. So we've got these like growth chambers. Like we're a pretty mana hungry deck, so despite only playing 22 lands. So since we are a mana hungry deck, we're playing a full force Sylvan Ranger, because like I tried it with Elvish Visionary, and while Visionary is much better late game, it's so horrible to draw, like have a 2-land hand, right? And you've got Thermal Karst and like Temporal Spring, and you're just ready. You're ready to get your opponent, and then you play your Elvish Visionary, and then you don't hit a land. And then on turn 3 you pass the turn, and then you probably lost the game at that point, because your LD is going to be not on time. So they can just start playing, Chittering Rats or their own Seagate or their Seagate Oracles or Mulldrifters or anything like that. So with 22 lands and 3 Utopia Sprawls and 4 Sylvan Rangers, we've got quite a lot of mana going on in the deck, despite 22 not being the highest land count ever. Coiling Oracles is pretty solid. Anytime it gives you a boost, it's outstanding, and it is a Visionary later on. So it's a fine draw later. Also, one of the nice things about having like this package of like value creatures is that you get to build in some Edict protection, which is always pretty important, And it also facilitates the gleeful sabotages in the sideboard, because you actually have a chance to conspire it, whereas if you have mostly wild growths and Utopia Sprawls, you need to rely on like different sideboard things. So we have 4 Thermokarsts, 4 Acid Moss as like the standard green LD package, but we also have 4 Temporal Spring. The Temporal Spring isn't exactly an LD spell, that is a fact, but when you pseudo blow up an Izzet Boilerworks, and so then they have to, like, they redraw it, and then they have to play it again, returning a different land to their hand, and then you blow up the Boilerworks. It's really good. And also, like, late game, it's often much better than an LD spell as well, when, you know, your opponent is maybe, like, empty-handed or needs to draw something to answer your, like, Ulamog's Crusher, and then you just, like, put anything on top of their deck so that they can't draw some drawn out. Also, another one of the big problems with the mono green LD decks is, wow, they're really bad against Gurmag Angler, since you fill their graveyard for them and then they only need a single swamp, and then like mono green doesn't have a lot to deal with a 5/5 that costs 1, outside of playing a Crusher, you know, before turn 10 or something, which didn't always happen. So this actually gives you an out to like an early Crusher if you just put them to if you put them to very few permanents and then they spend all of their mana to put a Gurmag Angler in play, then you just put it back on top of their deck and then they don't have any delve fuel left, and that's pretty good. We have a Singleton Pulse of Marasa, just to give us, you know, a little bit of extra value late game, and like a nice to have like a life total padding card to mise into against like the aggro decks. It's certainly not a mandatory card to have in your main deck, but I've been relatively happy with it most times so far. We have 1 Capsize. It's sort of, you know, sort of good on like turn 3 when if they have a bounce land again, but late game, obviously it's like if you've emptied your hand, you've played 2 Thermokarsts, an Acid Moss, a Reap and Sow, and then you just haven't drawn like one of the other things yet. Like Capsize is like the perfect card to draw late game. And you can also, if like the opponent has like very few lands but you don't have much pressure going on, you can also like Capsize your Coiling Oracle or your Mold Shambler for maximum value. Penumbra Spider is one that you don't see all that often, but it's like one of the best defensive creatures you can get. It's a little bit slow. I mean, it does cost 4 mana, but it blocks like all the blue flyer things. It eats a whole removal spell if it hits play. So, you know, it's if they're going to be Chainer's Edicting or Doomblading and that sort of thing, you still get something out of it. You get another spider. Incidentally, the fact that the black spider that comes out can't be ghastly demised is actually been relevant against blue-black in previous games. We only have a single Reap and Sow because it's pretty expensive. Like 4 mana destroy land isn't that great, but just having like an extra like 6 mana Acid Moss is still fine. And we have a couple of Mold Shamblers. You don't really ever want to cast this on 4, since blowing up a land is obviously what you actually want. So this should really be hiding out here somewhere, like in the more expensive mana slot. But you certainly can play it against the aggressive decks. Mold Shambler is actually a pretty nice one since it answers all sorts of random things. Like against Burn, for example, sometimes you'll like kill their only 2 lands, but they'll have a Curse of the Pierced Heart in play, and being able to destroy their curse actually comes up. In the 5-drop slot, so this is what you want to draw into just after you've blown up a bunch of things. Muldrifter, obviously great because it refills you. Hopefully you maybe draw some more LD, help put the game away. But Self-Assembler also can just let you kill the opponent sometimes. It might seem weird to only have 3 Self-Assemblers, but with 4 I kept on having like multiples in my hand, and Like, you only ever really need to draw one, and then if I haven't ever needed to actively play 4 of them in this deck. Like, if the first self-assembler, fetching self-assembler isn't good, then like probably the third one and the fourth one isn't good either. But so just having like 3 of them seems like a decent way to put the game away if your opponent's stumbling a little bit. And we only have 2 Crusher, even though we can get to 8 relatively often. We're still not getting there super ahead of schedule. I mean, it is like the best finisher, so I'm always happy to have a couple, but you never want multiples in your hand, because having multiples in your hand means that they're not cheaper cards, thus you're not slowing down your opponent, thus you don't even have enough time to play Crushers, if that makes sense. The sideboard, basically almost nothing against like Drake, because, well, I mean, we're playing like an LD deck. We're not going to combat them going late if we're not LDing them. So we're almost no sideboard cards for Drake, apart from a couple of Dispels, which are pretty handy. So the weakness of this deck is it's generally weak against like aggro strategies. So thus we have like these Hydroblasts, which are like mandatory against red decks. We have a bunch of Narcolepsies because they're good against Stompy and Gurmag Anglers. We have a bunch of Gleeful Sabotage because they're good against Affinity. Also, we can double LD them and be even happier in this deck, because that's our plan anyway. I have a couple of Nylea's Disciples. I had more of them, but I wanted like a couple of Dispels that also have applications against like Izzet Blitz and that sort of thing. Most of the sideboard cards are not too tricky. Like, it's fairly obvious what they're for. So I'm off to battle in a league. Hopefully we'll fight against decks that we are able to beat. And I'll see you there.